Dear Anne, Hogwarts isn't the same without you, but it seems you've summoned in some favors by ensuring my ego remains bruised with defeat during a rather lively mock duel in Hecate's class the first day. If you must know to whom do you owe the pleasure, then it would interest you to find out that we've welcomed a new classmate in our year. And no, she's not a transferee from another wizarding academy. She actually just started with her magical education, as she only just grew into her magic this late. Have you heard about an instant like that, Anne? Even so, Beatrice, our new classmate's name, seems to be quite the enigma. I dare say I wish to unravel more about her. If this is your way of sending a new perspective in my midst, then I shall endeavour to make the best out of this term, even though, well, I heard sharp is still as foul. But, you know what I mean. I've also enclosed your requested sweets from Honeydukes here. I hope you're doing better. Sebastian. I watched our shared owl, Pudge, fly off from the Owlery. The screech owl might take a day or two before coming back with a reply. I garnered it had more so to do with the tiny thing preferring to be spoiled with snacks in the company of my sister than being cooped up in a place where he rarely sent or delivered any letters. Imagine my surprise this morning when I was discreetly pulled aside after breakfast by our head of house, as Professor Ronan proudly granted me a fair number of house points for my endeavours at Hogsmeade yesterday, while jovially telling me I was excused for today's classes. And after heeding his advice to get myself properly checked by Nurse Blaney, I then used the better half of my time back in the dorm to properly compose a letter to my sister. But with that done, I found myself with more time in my hands, and couldn't help but wonder about Beatrice. Had she also been excused for today's classes as well? Where could she be in the castle during this time of day, perchance? A quick look at my pocket watch gave me a plausible insight on where she just might be at this time. Maybe we'd finally get around to spending study period together after a round at Crossed Wands. As it turns out, the round was already finished by the time I'd stopped by the clock tower, and subsequently looking for Beatrice between the Dada or Astronomy Tower proved to be for naught, as I'd only encountered Knock and Plumley, who'd notified me about asking her assistance on something or whatnot. I kept from sighing out in frustration, having gone back to wait by the Burning Witch portrait, completely lost in thought, pondering if maybe staying put in one place would prove more effective in crossing paths with Beatrice.
Sebastian, there you are.
There you are. I kept the excitement from my voice at finally having come across the girl I'd been looking for the better part of the morning. Granted, she had been the one to have found me first. You promised me an explanation for what happened in the Three Broomsticks. Not many students have Victor Rookwood's attention. What was that all about? It was one of the many worries I'd come to realise after waking up with a clearer head from a good night's rest.
I've never even met him. Perhaps he mistook me for another student.
If you say so. Beatrice's reply almost made me bristle, as if I'd sooner believe the notorious gang leader had just thought to single her out amidst the crowded pub, right after she'd demonstrated a curious form of magic. I won't press you now, but you will have to tell me what's going on at some point. You might need me. Or I, her, if she ever decided to share whatever secrets she had with me. So, why were you looking for me?
I need to find something for Professor Fig, but it's in the restricted section of the library.
He can't get it himself?
He was called away by Black at the last moment. I suppose I could wait to get a note from him, but...
You want to show some initiative. At this point, I was starting to see an opportunity that may help in winning Beatrice over.
You mentioned being clever enough not to get caught in the restricted section.
And I am. Meet me outside the library tonight, and tell no one. She'd looked so hopeful that it made me quick to answer, and I was confident with my reply, though I noticed how Beatrice still somewhat looked anxious. Her head slightly tilted as her eyes quickly roamed to check our surroundings for anyone who may be within earshot.
What's the worst that could happen if we're caught in the restricted section? Not expulsion, I hope.
I would have been expelled long before she'd have ever been sorted in Hogwarts if that was the case. Just detention, no doubt. But a word of caution or two will help. For one, avoid Peeves, the poltergeist. Aside from wanton destruction of property, he loves nothing more than telling on the likes of us.
And the librarian? How concerned should we be of Madame Scribner being there later tonight?
She'll be sure gone by the time we sneak in, and it's best next to tell you. Madame Scribner doesn't take kindly to clandestine activities taking place amongst her precious books.
so do all that you can to avoid her.
She and I have had our entanglements, but I can hold my own against her. You may not be so lucky.
Thank you, Sebastian. I'll meet you later.
And with that settled, aren't you forgetting to make time for something else other than the reasons I've heard about you walking almost everywhere about the castle? I crossed my arms, peering at Beatrice's confused expression, before realization seemed to dawn on her.
Oh, of course. I brought these charms-related textbooks I borrowed from the library, since you hadn't exactly mentioned the title you needed for reference.
Merlin! How many books did you check out? I was flabbergasted as she pulled out at least 4 books from the enchanted pockets of her robe.
Just enough to help me catch up, I hope. As much as Professor Fig's extensive library also helped, I wished we had more standard textbooks to assist us in which spells are more conducive to teach based on a student's year level. Huh.
Well, there's no fun in that at all, is there? Might end up limiting a student's capability in learning more advanced spells when he can handle it, I countered, helping take the heavy lot off her hands, one of which was, thankfully, the book I'd been looking for. Although, I'd have to agree that the textbooks they've safely assigned us to read are too old-fashioned for my choice of reference material.
I'm starting to believe that's the reason you've become quite clever in sneaking into unsanctioned places, perhaps.
Quite. Which makes me believe why we should stir clear of the library for our study session today.
Oh? Not even at the students' lounge area by the astronomy tower, then?
Beatrice, I wonder if you might be able to help me with a small, project.
Ugh, this was frustrating. But Beatrice had already turned towards the voice from the side of the stairwell.
Duncan, you wanted to speak with me?
Yes, well...
I watched the bespectacled boy hesitate as he warily eyed me standing close by behind Beatrice, a displeased frown surely marring my features as I waited for her.
I've heard all about you confronting trolls yesterday. Even aside from the dragon attack, it all seems to be amazing luck how you found yourself relatively unscathed from both.
I suppose it must seem that way. I'm not sure it's justified, though. It's all just a matter of circumstance, shall I say.
Ha! I'm starting to see Beatrice's tendency to brush things off. Surely she had to have acknowledged she had an uncanny ability at this point.
I'm going to presume your reputation is in fact warranted, in which case you are precisely the person I need.
This made me tense, leaning in on what Hobhouse had to say next that urgently required Beatrice's presence.
You see, we were learning to repel boggarts in Professor Hecat's class, and, well, mine unfortunately took the shape of a puffskein.
Was that right? I held back a laugh, to which I met Beatrice's disapproving glance before she'd turned her attention back on her housemate.
They're adorable. Why would you be afraid of a puffskein?
They seem adorable until one sticks its tongue up your nose. Regardless of how reasonable I believe my fear of puffskeins to be, I'm beginning to get a reputation as a coward. Some have even taken to calling me Puffskein Dunkeen.
Upon hearing the nickname, I blatantly grinned Beatrice's way as I observed her try to hide her own amusement behind her hand with a well-placed cough.
I'm sorry. Words can be cruel no matter how clever they may sound.
Everett thinks it is clever. Blast him.
Hobhouse almost looked close to fainting, now red in the face, from anger or embarrassment. I wasn't sure, but I kept a close eye in case Duncan was anywhere close to pulling his wand out on Beatrice for laughing at him.
Poppy keeps offering to help me in overcoming my fear, but I'm too afraid to take her up on it. Anyway, to make matters worse, I stupidly blurted out that I must be braver than people think, since I have been in the hidden herbology corridor.
The hidden herbology corridor?
This had me raising a brow as I'd never heard of such a place in the castle.
Yes. Rumour has it that the herbology professor before Professor Garlic kept dangerous plants there.
Duncan had looked so smug upon divulging this tiny bit of information that I felt a tick of annoyance when the bespectacled boy had the gall to give me a look as if he one-upped me on some regard.
Supposedly so overrun now that no one dares enter it anymore. I was hoping you could go there and bring back evidence that I could use to show that, well, I'd gone in. Say a bit of an exceptionally dangerous plant of some kind.
What sort of plants should I expect in the hidden herbology corridor?
Beatrice's line of questioning now had me on high alert.
I haven't a clue. But have you seen the kinds of plants Professor Garlic grows?
I hazarded a guess she hadn't. Not personally, anyway. This could prove dangerous for Beatrice, and I wasn't comfortable at the thought that she'd be risking herself for something as petty as that boy's courage.
If the previous professor was anything like her, I'd imagine they're not exactly harmless.
Then why are you sending her there in the first place? It took all of my will not to depulso Dunkeen into the wall behind where he stood just to knock some sense into him.
Very well. If I'm in the area, perhaps I shall take a look.
Not good. That most definitely didn't sound like a blatant refusal from Beatrice at all, and it made me feel dread slowly settle in the pit of my stomach.
Grand. I'd very much appreciate it. Come and find me if you get the proof. I shall be forever in your debt.
When Beatrice had parted ways with her housemate and was now walking beside me past the Transfiguration courtyard and through the central hall, I knew I had to make a decision. We should find some of that evidence now.
What?
That made her stop in her tracks, clearly caught off guard by my exclamation as we stopped by the hall's fountain. At the hidden herbology corridor, we should go and find it now.
But I thought we had a study session going on.
Which I'm sure you won't have your full attention on, seeing as you'd be otherwise preoccupied. I'd cast her a knowing look, seeing an adorable dusting of pink-shade Beatrice's cheeks as she tried to reason.
Well, I won't exactly know where to start.
She stopped short as I pointedly focused on one of the enchanted pockets of her robe, making her realize to pull out her field guide. Well? I observed the look of amazement that crossed Beatrice's face at perhaps seeing the very location indicated on the map she held. All she had to do was make that golden guiding thread pop out again. Care to lead the way?
Anything hidden must sound intriguing, shouldn't it? Have you been here before, Sebastian?
Never even heard of it. Until now, that is. I warily glanced at the dried foliage supposedly blocking the entryway.
These dry vines are one spark away from becoming kindling.
Before I could contribute in clearing the obstacle away, though,
Incendio!
I made a mental note never to get in her way. I see you've learned the fire-making charm now. I garner the ministry had given you some exceptions in casting magic outside school before the term began. I made way towards the wooden door first, warily pushing it open, revealing a crumbling set of stone stairs leading down further into darkness.
They only had me honing the most basic of spells and charms, nothing particularly offensive. I've only just learned Incendio from Professor Hecate during a private study session today, actually.
Beatrice didn't so much as hesitate when she took the first step down before I could even caution her.
I'm not keeping you from anything, am I? We might still be able to catch the lunch hour after this, but you might have classes.
Turns out my little act of heroism yesterday didn't go unwarranted, and I've been given time off from any studies today. I was hoping it was the same for your case.
As I've a lot to catch up on, unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Hence why Professor Fig advised me to seek out Professor Hecate this morning, and you shouldn't consider yesterday as a small feat. I wouldn't have gotten out of there unscathed without you.
Before I could relish Beatrice's sweet smile, however, the scant sunlight coming through the still open doorway was swiftly taken out, drowning the both of us in the musty, damp scent that encapsulated the place.
Well, nowhere to go but further down into these depths, I suppose.
Her almost humorous tone was the only thing keeping me from stubbornly wanting to lead the way. I just had to remain vigilant for Beatrice's sake, holding a hand out over her head as we crouched past a fallen beam in the corridor. Oof! I steadied myself, almost bumping into her still form amidst the dimness. Maybe she'd changed her mind in continuing our little excursion. Thinking of teasing her about it, I only then noticed her tense posture as she held an arm up sideways to keep me from taking a step further.
Devil's Snare. Thrives in darkness but sulks in the sun.
I observed that the only thing keeping the deadly vines from crawling towards us was the little bit of sunlight spilling through the collapsed overhead we'd just passed. This, really, was starting to look more like an errand than anything else.
Lumos.
She was already a step ahead of me before I could even huff out and make her see reason. My main objective now was to ensure we both got out of here relatively unharmed. I followed her further into the eerie corridor, the vines slithering away from our wand's light, almost looking like snakes in the shadows. It wasn't until I had just hoisted myself over a fallen wooden beam after her did she quickly turn right and head up a set of stairs. Beatrice!
I'll be quick. Surely these stairs must lead somewhere.
I was about to follow after her, past the beam, almost blocking the stairs' entryway, when I heard a series of incendios being casted. This made me look up just moments before I could stop Beatrice from jumping over the crumbled landing. Good gods! I felt as if my heart jumped into my throat as I continued to watch her lean over something.
I saw this, chest glowing amidst the dark.
Surely whatever you'd find there wouldn't be anything useful. What is it? Did something dangerous come out from that chest?
I might be able to use this. It looks like it's been enchanted not to gather dust or some sort.
She held something up from where she stood, inching closer to the crumbled landing. Beatrice, don't move! I caught her full attention then, a quizzical look on her face as she held onto whatever it was she found in that chest. Let me levitate you down from there, all right? Despite her look of uncertainty, the moment she nodded her consent, I made quick work to get her down smoothly, her outstretched hands grasping onto my shoulders once she got closer, which had me holding onto her waist until she found her footing, suddenly making me aware of her sweet scent as we stood alone in this musty corridor.
Well, that's one way to use those set of spells outside of crossed wands, then,
she'd said in amusement, the glow from her lumos highlighting her smile.
Speaking of sets, look at these clothes that I just found.
I had been quite engrossed with having her close, that when she'd mentioned the set of clothes she had over her arm, I was loath to admit that I missed her warmth the second she stepped away from me. That does look quite the ensemble. In nonchalant observation, I didn't want to admit that the way I gripped my wand wasn't because of how I'd just held Beatrice close.
It does look a bit fancy, but I won't complain about a spare change of clothes outside of our school uniform after, well, not having most of them arrive.
Of course, I empathized with how Beatrice survived a dragon attack. I just had to keep my mind from wandering anywhere else, as the faint scent of berries that surrounded her seemed to have ingrained itself into my senses. And just as we'd reached the end of the corridor leading to the only entryway to our left, Beatrice then stopped and stared at a seemingly blocked cavern straight ahead. Oh no, she isn't thinking of...
Incendio!
Beatrice had blasted at the blocks of wood and debris strong enough to ignite a forgotten torch, burning away tendrils of the deadly vine that surrounded where it hung by a post.
Seems the devil's snare is protecting another chest of some kind.
I had yet to follow where she laid her sights on, though, as my eyes remained rooted on the water between us and her coveted prize. More specifically, the writhing dark mass beneath that made the otherwise demonic plant look absolutely diabolical underwater. Now, hang on for just a moment. I started as Beatrice neared towards the water's edge.
I was hoping Accio might help.
It won't work. That chest looks heavy to force towards you, and with whatever summoning spell you used in Hogsmeade, I doubt you'd want to risk anything of value that might be inside there. I countered, not wanting to focus too much on how she bit on her lip in thought as I then proceeded to hand her my school robe, coat, and vest.
What in heaven's Sebastian?
I'd folded the cuffs of my shirt sleeves over my forearms, before I had cast at the remaining unlit torches I'd spotted on the surrounding posts overlooking the water. I'll get it for you. Opting to keep my shoes on against whatever other things I might step on beneath the surface, it was too late for me to remember to brace myself against the cold of the water that reached up to my shoulders. Despite that, I gritted my now slightly chattering teeth and trudged on, arm held up above my head as my wand illuminated the short stretch across. The ice-cold air that welcomed me once I surfaced was far worse, though, and I quickly made sure to clean out the chest's contents, not bothering to assess it long enough. Before I was back to treading across the water, comforted by the side of Beatrice anxiously looking towards me whilst she had her arm stretched out over the water's edge, the light from her wand almost like a beacon that guided my way back. Before I had a chance to worry about looking like a soaked Krupp puppy in front of her, though, I was immediately met by a strong gust of warm air the moment I surfaced. Thankfully, it seems Beatrice was already familiar with the hot air charm that made me quickly dry off before she'd hurriedly handed me my pieces of uniform.
Honestly, Sebastian, that was reckless of you.
She surprised me by quickly righting my tie and assisted in buttoning up my vest the moment I put it on. Speak for yourself. I couldn't help but cheekily retort back, but my smile froze on my face as Beatrice's intense green gaze looked up at me in clear defiance.
Did you at least find something you can use?
I went in and got it for you. You should wear it. Here. With her gaze now pulled from me, I tried to calm myself down by focusing on righting my sleeves and pulling my coat on, thinking that maybe prolonged exposure in her presence was starting to befuddle my mind.
It's a fine jumper, Sebastian. I think this would look great on you.
She'd held it out close to me with both arms. Just because it's mainly in my house colours and looks absolutely Scottish? I shot her a teasing glance as I combed through my hair, trying to put a bit of semblance back to it.
Well, you might need it for your next trip to Hogsmeade.
She was right, though. I wasn't quite fond of the mostly threadbare clothing my uncle would just usually hand me. An otherwise uneventful trip to Hogsmeade, I hope. I caved, gently taking the piece of clothing from her hands as I tucked it under my arm.
I do suppose I owe you a butterbeer for the trouble I caused you the first time we were there.
The sweet smile she flashed my way sent my heart racing for reasons other than the fact that we now ventured through a corridor infested with the devil's snare. The vines that hang from the ceiling slithered away from our wand's light before I caught sight of what we had been looking for from the start.
I imagine a piece of that enormous venomous tentacula would be enough for Duncan to prove his bravery. It's the stationary type of plant, isn't it?
Doesn't make it any less dangerous. We both kept away from its two huge, gaping mouths, as I rapidly thought of ways to distract it to get closer.
What are the chances it'd go for lacewing flies?
She'd asked, already procuring a bottle from her robes. I read these plants mostly prefer chisperfles, but those are worth a try. Better flies than our fingers in their mouths. Or worse. We watched in bated breath as the faint glow from the insects flew closer towards the venomous tentacula, and as soon as each mouth clamped shut around a cluster, Beatrice had quickly but quietly plucked away a huge leaf near its trunk, wisely backing away with her gaze still trained on the plant in case it would retaliate. I suppose now would be a best time than any to find our way out of here. I felt the tension I'd been holding slowly subside as my shoulders relaxed.
I couldn't agree more. But not before getting at least a couple galleons richer.
I followed her gaze then to the two slightly shining stacks of coins left on the table behind us.
You don't suppose anyone would still come looking for them, would you?
Her gaze seemed to glimmer with mischief back at me, causing me to smile as I pocketed my share of galleons. No matter how dusty, currency was still currency. I think it's safe to suppose not. And I garner that ladder there might just lead us back to the school's greenhouses. I nodded towards a darkened alcove filled with hanging pots, the tip of my wand's light barely showing a silhouette of its rails leading up. Go on. Ladies first. I all but urged Beatrice to a safer setting, still wary of the enormous poisonous plant that lay before us. Though the next hurdle I had to face was focusing on keeping my head down and away from Beatrice's skirt as she started to climb up the aforementioned ladder. Would you happen to be free this weekend? I honestly hadn't known what had made me blurt out that question all of a sudden, as I waited by the ladder's base.
It depends, really. If I'm not given any additional private lessons or assignments even during the weekend. Ugh.
The flood of sunlight had me squinting.
Why do you ask?
She asked a moment later as only her head peeked over from above, waiting for me to follow. It's nothing, really. I second-guessed myself in asking her, as I now made my way up. I was actually wondering what you'd say to another trip to Hogsmeade this weekend.
Not letting our extra galleons line our pockets for much longer, are we?
She grinned at me as I closed the trapdoor beneath us, anxiously waiting for her reply.
No matter the case, I'd surely make time for it, don't worry.
It's a date, then? Like, a study date? You know, where you can ask me any questions you may have about catching up. I stopped before I could further turn into a blubbering mess.
I'd love that, actually. Thank you, Sebastian. You've been helping me a lot.
Beatrice had smiled at me sweetly, and there it was again. This feeling of my heart skipping a beat at seeing the faint blush that dusted her cheeks.
Now how about getting this leaf to Duncan first, before a quick lunch at the Great Hall and everything else?
I wasn't quite sure then if I'd have just nodded in complete agreement to anything Beatrice had to say, though I was all too aware of the grin on my face as I looked forward to the weekend.